This video will look in depth at the poem London, written by William Blake in about 1800. Now, Blake may well be the father of the Romantics, but this poem I think is far more interesting in terms of how it presents the view of a place, and particularly the view of the society, the power that society has in 19th century London, where Blake is seeing the destructiveness for the common man. Blake uses his narrator particularly effectively, I think, in this poem, and that's something I think we need to focus on. So from the beginning, what does it help us to know? We're not too bothered about massive contextual detail that we can bolt on, but things that help us to possibly understand the direction it goes in. So it helps us to think that London at this point was the centre of the British Empire, and to many that is a symbol of glory. It still is to some people now, but Blake is using that to look in a different direction. It was also a great time of change, though. We are about a decade, as it says here, after the French Revolution, and people like Blake saw the French Revolution very positively as something, again, that was about doing something to promote and help the lowest of the low, the poorest people in any kind of society, who of course Blake is addressing here. So there's a sense of that revolutionary idea within this poem. Blake himself was highly anti-establishment, and I think you'll see within this, and I'll take you through particularly the idea that it is establishments that he is attacking, the power of particular establishments a lot of the way through here. We also need to know that within the poem, chartered essentially means managed by business, by society, and managed for profit. That will be important when you look at how it's used within the poem. And manacles, which are the centre of a very, very important and significant image in the poem, are chains that bind the hands together. Okay. So let's deal with what happened first of all. We start with a speaker wandering through the streets of London. He sees, and very importantly, hears the pain and distress of every person he meets, even the very young. The hears is particularly important because the majority of the poem is about hearing. He suggests they're chaining themselves up inside their own minds. So at this point, that's what his point is. And then he goes on to three examples of individual people being oppressed or ignored by the main institutions of the country. He talks about child chimney sweeps, which we know a great deal about, but he compares that to the idea of the church, who should be doing something about it, should be protecting the children in their society, but aren't. He focuses in on soldiers, but talks about how they're being used by the monarchy to protect themselves and are putting themselves in the front line for the benefit of an institution. And then he comes through to the idea of young prostitutes. How young is unclear, but the idea of them being exploited by the middle class men in particular. So that's a sense of the narrative of the poem here. The speaker, as he wanders, commenting on what he sees and particularly what he hears, very importantly deals with everybody early on and then focuses on particular people afterwards. Okay, so we start with the title. As we said in the things you need to know, the name of this place evokes images of grandeur and glory because of the idea of the empire and its past and whatever. So just calling it that sounds like it will be something grand and spectacular. But Blake is preparing us because he's going to give us an alternative perspective. Okay? Right? A very different London. So let's start with the first stanza. It's much more gentle, and do notice that the sound of the words is much more gentle as he goes along. He uses much more vowel-heavy language. So at this point, the emotions that he shows so clearly as he goes through are much more tempered. Now, we start with, again, also a very casual verb. He is wandering. It seems a sense of aimlessness. So have a think about that as how that establishes, to begin with, our initial reaction, that he's just wandering. Before the idea of chartered comes in, and we talked about what chartered suggests. It's repeated quite deliberately, and again reminds us the way the city seems so controlled and organised, but also underneath has that aspect of for whose benefit, for a business benefit. And of course asks the question, how can you charter a river? The water isn't even the same the whole way through. It's constant movement, it's constant change, and so already he's essentially mocking, to a degree, the way that people feel they can control and take charge of things that they can't. Mention also the idea of using flow in that situation. And then he focuses in that second part on the word of mark. Now, in a poem that is so concerned with hearing, with noise, with the sense of hearing, to start with things that are so focused around the sense of vision is quite significant. He begins by looking at people and marking their marks. And that double meaning is very, very interesting, okay, to notice. He marks, he notices, marks, blemishes, okay? Visual signs of the fact that they are feeling weak, that they are feeling sad, or they are weak and are sad. Marks. Now, the alliteration of weakness and woe takes that meaning that we just talked about and links them together, okay? And I've suggested there to think about that connection of the two and the repetition of every that then continues into the next stanza. And use those as examples to think, what is the speaker saying he's marking? Weakness, woe in everybody. He's not necessarily restricting it to a particular class or group at all. So when we carry that on into stanza 2, we have this repetition of every that we've just mentioned. No exceptions. And when we say no exceptions, it's not so much saying, so this includes the poor or needy. It means it isn't just the poor or needy. Everybody is unhappy. And the every is repeated by a kind of a group of different groups of different people. Man, infants, all kinds of voices. Everybody. And he also repeats this idea, a sense of crying out loud, a sound that we hear coming back later on as well. Now, the end of stanza 2 is essentially the centre of the poem. A central image, mind-forged manacles. Really, really central to your understanding of London. I can't imagine any answer on London that doesn't use this image, okay? Every person, remember, is forging these themselves. They're not being forged for them, they are forging them. So it is essentially the mindset, the place they've been put by society that means they are chaining themselves up. Think to a very well-known, I think it was Rousseau, who at a similar time to this, around the time of the French Revolution, talked about how, I think his quote was, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. This sense that we are free by our natures, but we chain ourselves up within our societies. Now, it's also just as important that it is forged in their minds. You cannot see it. So it's to do with their thoughts, it's to do with the way they perceive things around them. They are chaining themselves up. And then it finishes with a colon. Now that colon follows the idea of him hearing these manacles. And so it's about to list the things that he hears. Now, what there I think is interesting is that he doesn't say he can see it, he can only hear it, as though it is hidden away, and you have to be listening out effectively. And this list then begins with two examples, the chimney sweepers and the soldiers. Both of them focused on sound with the rhyme between cry and sigh. Think about the meaning of those particular sounds. Cry, particularly, we've had repeated in stanza 2. We will have it come back in the final stanza. Why is it being used so much, and potentially in different situations? And why a sigh? What that suggests about their situation. Now, hapless, as it says, a kind of echo of a Paul's that we've had just above, the Church of Paul's and the hapless. It's got the same APLS kind of structure to it. Kind of means a sense of unfortunate with a sense of unhappiness at the same time. It's not hopeless, hapless. So, what I've suggested here is Blake is clearing the soldier from any responsibility for his situation. It's not his fault he's here. So think about that impact. It's a very, very loaded adjective, well worth considering why it's being used and how it's being used. And finally, with the soldier, we've got this idea of running in blood down palace walls. Now, we had just above the blackening church, which is a very interesting image as well, the idea that the church has been made black. A nice image with the chimney sweepers, the blackening of a chimney sweep as well, but has been blackened, its name has been blackened essentially by every single ignoring of the situation with these children. But to balance with that, we've got the soldiers and the palace, the sense of a palace here that is behind walls. Now, I've said here before, this is a really complex image, because how does a sigh run in blood? Okay, and the blood isn't really running down those palace walls, it's all that kind of idea. So when we unpack it, what do we look at? We look at that sense that the palace has protective walls up, that outside those walls it has a soldier guarding it. And there seems to be this idea of revolution, this sense of, like the French Revolution, people rising up and attacking, and it will be the soldier who has to defend them. And it will be the soldier's blood that will run down the walls. Again, linking, I suppose, the sigh, the unhappiness, the sadness of his situation with the potential outcome and the way that he will be the one who has to stand in place. And while the blood runs down the walls, they are still sat behind them, the monarchy, and safe and happy. So there's a great deal, and this is why I think London is a good one to go for. There's a great deal in here where you can draw out detail and depth from these really abstract images. And we'll come back to that again in a minute. And that takes us into the final stanza. Now, I mentioned how the sound of the words in the first stanza was quite gentle, quite vowel-led. By this point, we're full of plosives and harsh sounds. Most midnight streets, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. He's almost spitting out the words, it feels, as we're going along. And I think it's a good example of how Blake is putting this together, that his speaker appears to be just becoming more and more angry and aggressive and disturbed as the poem goes on. Now, the use of the word most, as I said there, emphasises for us that this stanza has the very worst elements of London in it, that this brings us to the climax. We've seen something, but we haven't seen nothing yet. This is the worst. And of course, to the idea that these are midnight streets. This is the time when things are most hidden away, most in the darkness, in the background. Now, as we've said, I've linked it here to the infant and the chimney sweep earlier, and what will be the newborn infant beneath. The emphasis on the young. There's quite a lot of focus here on youth, and I suppose you'd say that the soldier potentially could be seen as quite young as well. He's talking about the way that the youth are being oppressed by society, not just people. The youth are being pushed down a great deal. And of course, the idea that the harlot is youthful is significant as well, because a sense that somebody so young should be in a profession that is so advanced and lacks innocence or whatever, that they have been forced to grow up in that way. Now, I picked out here curse, blasts and tears as sound words to highlight the horror of a child being born, as I said there, to sounds of anger, that it exists. Now, I want you to get that picture clearly in your head. A sense that there is a prostitute giving birth to an infant, and of course, for whatever reason, probably because, you know, she can't earn her money anymore and she couldn't afford to keep the infant, the first sound that this infant hears is a curse. Is it being cursed? And it blasting it. So not just casually, it's blasting with curses. And that's linked into its own tears, as though those tears are for, and they can't be, obviously literally as it's newborn, but those tears are for the sadness of the life that is already ruined for it. So I've said to you there, notice the juxtaposition of harlot and infant, of the anger of the harlot and the tear of the infant, almost placed next to each other. And then we go on to the final image here. Blighting with plagues the marriage hearse. And say here, another very, very complex image to finish stanza 4, like the one that finished stanza 3. There's a lot that could be in here, and you can see it in many, many different ways. But what we do have is the idea of a spreading plague. Okay? And, you know, there's a literal and metaphorical meaning here. Okay? You could be talking about, you know, like sexually transmitted diseases, as well as a metaphorical plague of disaster that comes across. But the sense of it spreading and killing and destroying is what's at the heart here. Now, I think the link between the marriage hearse, this oxymoronic phrase, and the birth of the infant seems to me, and this is just one interpretation, to link the idea of the middle classes to the plight of the harlot. Now, I say that because marriage, I think we can see here as a middle class institution, okay? And by linking death to marriage, putting them together as though marriage is going to lead to death, you know, whether by the spreading of diseases or, you know, just the death of the marriage, I think creates a sense that the middle classes are also self-destroying in the way that we hear so many. So when we talk about this idea of the mind-forged manacles, it's not just the harlot, it's not just the chimney sweep, it's not just the soldier. It brings in other people as well. These middle-class marriages are essentially, as well, forging manacles in their mind through their selfishness and their exploitation of the lower classes. Now, I think in terms of close analysis, I've just literally skimmed the surface here, really, in some ways. There are so many things you can draw out of this. And this is one of the things I would say in terms of the form and the layout of the poem that we can get. Focus in on. It's this idea that overall the structure of the poem makes it appear very simple. And the phrase I often use is like a nursery rhyme. It's got that very basic kind of bouncy rhythm to it. It's a very, very obvious rhyme, sort of half rhyme. It's very clear. And he's done this quite deliberately to contrast, I feel, with the complexity that is underneath, the abstract imagery that we've got. Is that because it should appear, or it should be simple, but it isn't? Or it appears or is sold to us as something simple, but it isn't? Whichever we look at it as, the abstract imagery is drawing us into something deeper underneath. Overall, of course, the poem takes that form of us wandering through the streets with the speaker, and that sense of wandering, going through worse horrors as we go, Blake would be very aware, of course, of Dante's Inferno, a classic Italian poem, which is about the idea of entering hell and going further and deeper into hell and seeing things worse and worse as you go further along. And I think there's a sense of that to what we're seeing here, that we're almost wandering further and deeper into hell as we go further and seeing worse and worse horrors. Now, if we split it, remember there are the very clear first half of the poem up until the Mindforged Manacles, which seems to split the two. Very much that point is about the general public, everybody, where the second then lists these particular individual examples. So that gives them two particularly different ideals here. And as I mentioned as we went through, the harshness of the consonants increasing as his anger does, links into that idea of the worse and worse horrors. He sees worse and worse and his anger gets worse as we go through. And there's no resolution at the end, because there is no solution at this point. We also have the repetition of the poem. It's very interesting that it uses very few words, and some of those are repeated over and over. It would say that the poem is very in your face if it wasn't for the abstractness of a lot of the imagery that's in there. But it certainly makes the point. Every, cry, cry, cry. So the big ideas that are behind it, the power and conflict ideas that may come up. First of all, what have we got? The impact of the power of the institutions. That's something I think you want to consider. If we take it to be the church, the monarchy, business, even the middle class, consider how their power is represented and how it's being misused. Consider why sound is so significant. Not just his use of sound techniques, but the idea of hearing as well throughout it. It's all very much about sound. And maybe that's connected as well to the idea of this post-industrial London that we're talking about. Blake has no fan of the Industrial Revolution at all. And the sense of a noise overtaking his city may well be something that he feels that he could use in that very, with unpleasant connotations here. Then take this idea, it kind of links to that idea of the power of the big institutions, but it's that contrast between the state of the society and the suffering of the people, and the link between the two that he's drawing out for us. And then finally, think about the portrait of London as a place he's putting across. Notice there's nothing about its grand empire, well-known landmarks or anything along that idea here. It's very much about the people, and it's about the institutions at the heart of it. Think about his point. Think about the idea post-French Revolution of what Blake is trying to set out for us.